In the autumn of 1669, an old man lifted a cup of sake to seal a peace he had been promised. His name was Shakushain. He was an Ainu chief, old enough to remember the northern world the way it had been before the trade tightened into a chain around it. For months, he had led the largest uprising the indigenous people of that world had ever raised against the Japanese, against a trading domain that was slowly strangling them. But he was running short of gunpowder, and the enemy had more guns than he could ever answer. So he came to a Japanese camp to lay down the war. There was a ceremony, there was sake, and as he drank to the peace they had offered him, the men who offered it killed him. The chief who had united a coast was struck down, not in battle, but at the table where he had been promised his life. Ghost of Yotei, the game set in this northern land, wraps moments like this in the language of curses, vengeance, and ghosts. The real history needs no ghosts. What happened on that frontier has an older and plainer name: betrayal. Here is what the game does not tell you, and what most people who play it will never learn. The land in Ghost of Yotei is not really Japan, not yet. In 1603, where the game begins, the island we now call Hokkaido was called Ezo, and it was not ruled from the south. It was the world of the Ainu, a people with their own language, their own gods, and their own law, who had lived and hunted and traded there for centuries. The old chief who would one day die over that cup of sake was born into this world while it was still its own. Within 300 years, almost all of it would be gone. The land, the names, the language, until in the 1980s, fewer than 15 people on Earth still spoke it in daily life. This is not the story of a lone warrior haunting a mountain. It is the story of how a frontier became a colony, how trade became a chain, and how a people who were never asked were slowly written out of their own home. This is the true story behind Ghost of Yotei, and it begins and ends with an old man and a broken promise. Ghost of Yotei opens in the year 1603. For Japan, that year is a hinge of history. It is the year Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun and began the regime that would rule for over 2.5 centuries. The long civil wars were ending. A new and rigid order was settling over the islands, an order of fixed ranks, sealed borders, and absolute obedience. But the game is not set in that Japan. It is set in the far north, on the island then called Ezo, beyond the reach of the new shogunate. And that choice, whether the game says so plainly or not, is the most historically interesting thing about it. The game's own story leans into the lawlessness of that frontier. Years before it begins, in 1587, in a night the game calls the Night of the Burning Tree, a band of outlaws known as the Yotei Six destroys the hero's family and leaves her pinned to a tree and left for dead. She survives, and 16 years later she returns as a wandering avenger named Atsu, hunting the men who did it across the shadow of one great mountain. It is a revenge tale, and the avenger and her enemies are fiction. None of them existed. The game released in 2025 to enormous success, a follow-up to Ghost of Tsushima, and it carried millions of players into a beautifully rendered version of this northern world, which makes it worth asking what that world was actually like. In 1603, Ezo was not part of Japan. It was a borderland where three forces pressed against one another. There were the indigenous Ainu, who had lived there for centuries. There were Japanese settlers and traders pushing up from the south, and there were the kinds of men who always gather at the edge of a collapsing war: masterless samurai and opportunists, men with violence to sell and nowhere left to sell it. The end of Japan's long civil wars had thrown countless warriors out of work, and some drifted toward the edges of the known map in search of a fight or a fortune. Ezo, only half-charted and loosely watched, was exactly such an edge. The Japanese foothold there was still little more than the Matsumae outpost in the south, and a scatter of traders along the coast. But footholds grow, and the people already living on that island had no way of knowing how quickly this one would. The great landmark of the game is the mountain itself. Mount Yotei is real. It is a near-perfect volcanic cone in southwestern Hokkaido, so striking that it is often called Eizo Fuji, the Fuji of the North. So the costume the game wears is a real place at a real and dangerous moment. The Japanese presence in the south of the island was still small, but it was the thin end of a wedge. A single clan had just been handed something that would change everything, not at first through conquest, but through trade. To understand what Ghost of Yotei is really standing on, you have to understand two things the game leaves in its background: who the Ainu were, and what the Japanese on that frontier had just been allowed to do to them. The Ainu are the indigenous people of the north, of Hokkaido, and once of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands beyond it. Their distinct culture is generally traced to around the 13th century, though their roots in the land run far deeper. They were not Japanese, and they did not think of themselves as Japanese. They had their own language, unrelated to Japanese, and crucially, a language with no writing system. It was carried entirely in speech, in story, and in song. Their history was memory, held in the mouths of the living. Among the Ainu, long oral epics preserved the deeds of heroes and gods, recited and passed down across generations. A people without writing is not a people without history. It is a people whose history can be silenced simply by silencing its voices, a fact that will matter terribly by the end of this story. They lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering, above all by the salmon that filled the rivers and the deer and bear of the forests. They wore robes woven from the inner bark of elm and other trees, and many Ainu women bore distinctive tattoos around the mouth. They were also traders, moving goods along the coasts and rivers, linked into a northern web of exchange that reached far up toward the Amur River and the lands beyond Sakhalin. They were not isolated. They were a node in a trading world older than the shogunates itself. Through that northern network, goods from the Asian mainland, including prized textiles, passed down into Ainu hands, and sometimes onward to the Japanese. This made the Ainu not a backward people at the end of the world, but middlemen in a long-distance commerce that the southern clans would come to want very much to control for themselves. And they were deeply spiritual in a way that shaped everything. In the Ainu world, the things around them, the bear, the owl, fire, water, even the tools of the home, were inhabited by kamui, spirits or gods that had entered the human world wearing those forms. The bear especially was no mere animal, but a divine guest. And in one of the most important Ainu ceremonies, a bear was honored and ritually sent back to the world of the gods, carrying gifts and gratitude with it. To hunt, to eat, to use a thing, was to stand in a relationship with the spirit inside it, a relationship with obligations on both sides. We have to be careful here, because almost everything written down about the Ainu in this early period was written by outsiders, by Japanese officials and traders, not by the Ainu themselves. A people without writing, described mainly by the very power moving in on them, reaches us second-hand at best. Much of what we say about them in the 1600s is reconstructed, and we should hold it with humility. But this much is clear. In 1603, the Ainu were not a vanishing remnant waiting to be civilized. They were a living world, with their own order, on their own land. What was coming for them did not arrive as an army. It arrived as a contract. On the southern tip of Eizo sat a single Japanese clan, the Matsumae. If the name sounds familiar to anyone who has played the game, it should. The Matsumae appear in Ghost of Yotei itself as a faction in its story. They are one of the few pieces of that world that were not invented. They were entirely real, and what they actually did on this frontier is stranger and more consequential than anything a video game villain gets up to. They were a small house, clinging to the bottom edge of a cold island, and they had a problem that made them unlike any other domain in Japan. They had no rice. In Tokugawa, Japan, power and rank were measured in rice. A domain's wealth, its obligations, its very status were counted in koku, units of rice it could produce. But Ezo was too cold for the rice economy that defined the rest of the country. By that measure, the Matsumae were almost nothing. So they were given something else. Around 1604, the new shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu granted the Matsumae an exclusive right, a monopoly. They and only they would control trade with the Ainu of Ezo. No other Japanese could legally trade with them. Think about what that meant. A people with their own thriving network of exchange were now, on the Japanese side, funneled through a single gate, controlled by a single clan whose entire wealth depended on squeezing that gate. This was not the first friction between the two peoples. More than a century earlier, in the 1400s, Ainu anger at the growing Japanese presence had already exploded into open war in a famous uprising led by a chief remembered as Koshamin. It had been crushed by the warrior house from which the Matsumae would descend. From the very start then, the southern foothold had expanded against Ainu resistance, fort by fort along the coast. By the time the Tokugawa monopoly was granted, the Matsumae had already spent generations learning how to manage, divide, and pressure the people they traded with. The pattern, Ainu grievance and Japanese suppression, was older than the monopoly. The monopoly just gave it a permanent engine. At first, the trade could look almost like partnership. The Ainu brought dried salmon, furs, and eagle feathers prized for arrows. The Japanese brought rice, iron tools, lacquerware, and sake, exchanged at fortified trading posts along the coast. But a monopoly is not a partnership. Over the decades, the terms bent further and further in one direction. The rate of exchange was set by the side that controlled the gate, and it was set against the Ainu. By the 1660s, the Matsumae had pushed the terms to where a fixed measure of Ainu goods bought far less than it once had. And the domain did something more corrosive than cheating on prices. To keep the Ainu dependent, frontier policy discouraged them from learning the Japanese language and from taking up rice farming of their own. A people kept from the tongue of the men they traded with, and from growing their own staple food, is a people deliberately locked into needing exactly what the monopoly sold. This is the quiet machinery the game leaves in its background. Not a sword at the throat, but a hand on the scale. Year after year, the people of the North traded the salmon and furs of their own land for less and less, to a single clan handed the only legal door. A hungry, cheated, cornered people does not stay quiet forever. By the 1660s, the pressure on the frontier was nearing a breaking point, and what finally lit it began as these things often do, not as a war against the empire, but as a quarrel much closer to home. The fire did not start as a rebellion. It started as a feud. In the river valleys of eastern Ezo, two Ainu groups had fallen into a long and deepening conflict over hunting and fishing grounds. The kind of dispute that can simmer for years and then turn deadly. On one side stood the people led by Shakushain, the old chief from the opening of this story, by now a powerful figure who had spent a long life watching the trade tighten around his people year after year. On the other stood a rival group and its own leaders. This local war ground on through the 1660s, and people were killed on both sides. Crucially, both groups lived inside the Matsumae trading world. The Japanese domain was never far away, watching the conflict, sometimes leaning on one side, always aware that disorder among the Ainu could threaten the trade it lived on. Then, in 1669, came the deaths that changed everything. A prominent man on the rival Ainu side was killed, and around the same time, an Ainu envoy connected to the dispute also died. According to the accounts that survive, a bitter suspicion spread among the Ainu that this death was no accident, that it was a poisoning tied to the Japanese side. We have to be careful, because here we are deep in territory recorded mainly by the Japanese, and a suspicion is not a proven fact. But what matters historically is not only whether the poisoning was real. What matters is that the Ainu believed it, and that belief detonated something far larger than a local feud. Because Shakushain did something no Ainu leader had managed before. He turned a feud into a front. He sent word across a wide stretch of Ezo, calling on Ainu communities who had their own quarrels with one another to set them aside and rise together, against the Japanese, against the trading posts, against the entire system squeezing them all. For a people organized into many separate and often rival communities, this was extraordinary. It was the closest the Ainu of Ezo would ever come to a single united war. In the summer of 1669, the uprising struck. Across the frontier, Ainu fighters fell on the Japanese scattered among them, on the traders, on the men at the trading posts, and the boats and camps strung along the coast. By the accounts that survive, around 270 Japanese were killed in the first wave, and ships and stores of goods were seized. The uprising was not confined to a single valley. Word of it spread along both the eastern and western reaches of the island, drawing in communities across great distances, an astonishing coordination for a people with no central state and no written orders to carry. The Ainu fought as the hunters they were, with bows and arrows, falling on the isolated and the unprepared. Long stretches of the frontier slipped out of Japanese hands entirely. For a moment, the thin Japanese hold on the edge of Ezo shook. The people who had been cheated at the gate for generations had risen, and for the first time, they had risen together, behind one chief. But Shakushain was about to collide with the one thing his coalition could not match. Not courage, not numbers, gunpowder. The Matsumae could not let the uprising stand, and they did not have to fight it on equal terms. The domain, backed by the wider weight of the Japanese order behind it, brought firearms to the frontier. The Ainu had some guns, obtained through trade, but nothing like a steady supply, and almost no way to make their own gunpowder. In a short raid, that gap can be survived. In a long war, it decides everything. The Japanese could keep shooting. The Ainu, in time, could not. The Matsumae mustered their forces and pushed up the coast, and the scale of the revolt drew the attention of the wider Japanese authorities, who could not allow an entire frontier to slip away. A coalition spread across great distances, with no central treasury, no armory of its own, and held together largely by the authority of one aging chief, could not sustain a long war against that kind of weight. Time was on the side of the men who would never run out of powder. The great coalition began to falter. The momentum of that first summer faded into a grinding campaign that Shakushain was slowly losing the means to fight. His fighters could still strike, but they could not win a war of attrition they had no way to supply. His options narrowed with every passing week. In the autumn of 1669, he chose to make terms. He came to negotiate. A peace was arranged, gifts were exchanged, and a ceremony was held to mark the end of the war, sealed as such things were, with sake. And at that ceremony, the Japanese killed him. The sources differ on the exact details, and later retellings have added their own colors, so we should not pretend to know every gesture of that night. But the core is not seriously in doubt. Shakushain came in peace, under the understanding that the war was over, and he was assassinated at the gathering meant to end it. The chief who had united the coast was struck down not on the battlefield, where he might have expected it, but at the table where he had been promised safety. Stop and sit with that for a moment. He had not been beaten in the field and forced to surrender at sword point. He had been offered peace. He had accepted it. He had walked in trusting the word given to him, and the word was the weapon. This is the moment Ghost of Yotei echoes without ever naming it, when it fills its northern world with poisoned cups, broken oaths, and vengeance that outlives the dead. The game reaches for ghosts and curses to give that feeling a shape. The history underneath it is colder and far more human. A cornered people rose, a chief gambled on peace, and the promise itself was the trap. With Shakushain dead and the coalition leaderless, organized resistance collapsed. The uprising that had so briefly united the Ainu of Ezo was over. And what followed the betrayal was, in the long run, worse than the war. Because losing the war did not simply leave the Ainu defeated. It left them open. After 1669, the trap closed harder. The failed uprising did not loosen the Matsumae grip, it tightened it. The Ainu were brought under firmer control, made to acknowledge their subordinate place in the trading order, and the domain pressed its advantage with a freer hand. Over the following decades, the system itself mutated into something even more extractive. The Matsumae, always short of real wealth, increasingly handed their trading rights over to merchants. Rather than run the trade themselves, the samurai leased sections of the coast to merchant houses in exchange for a fee, and those merchants ran the posts to wring out every profit they could. This shift mattered enormously. A merchant who has paid for the right to exploit a stretch of coast has every reason to extract as much from it as fast as possible, and little reason to care what is left behind. Under this contracted system, Ainu life was bent ever harder toward the needs of Japanese commerce. Many Ainu were drawn or pressed into labor at the fisheries and trading posts, working the very abundance that had once been the foundation of their own independent world. The salmon runs that had fed a people now fed a profit they did not share. Families could be broken up by the demands of distant labor, and the old balanced relationship kept eroding into something closer to a managed workforce on its own land. There was disease, too. Contact brought epidemics, including smallpox, against which the Ainu had little defense, and outbreaks tore through communities already under strain. Over the long run, disease and hardship cut deeply into Ainu numbers, hollowing out settlements that had stood for centuries. A people does not need to be conquered in battle to be diminished. It can be thinned by sickness, scattered by forced labor, and starved of the independence that once held it together, worn down as surely as by any war, and far more quietly. Resistance did not entirely die. In 1789, far to the northeast in the region around Kunashir and Menashi, another Ainu uprising broke out against the brutal conditions of the contracted trade. It too was suppressed, and harshly. But by then the balance had tilted so far that such revolts could flare and be crushed without changing the underlying direction at all. And that direction never wavered. With each generation, the frontier became a little less the Ainus and a little more an economic colony of the South. The land had not been taken in a single dramatic war. It had been leased, indebted, fished out, and worked into submission, gate by gate, contract by contract, season by season. By the 19th century, the question was no longer whether the Ainu would keep their world. It was whether anything of it would survive at all. Once the South stopped merely trading with the North and decided formally to swallow it whole. The end of the Ainu world as a world did not come with a sword. It came with a signature and a school. In 1869, in the first years of Japan's modern Meiji era, the government formally annexed the island. Ezo, the frontier, was given a new name, Hokkaido. It was now officially Japan, and the people who had lived there for centuries became a problem to be managed inside a nation racing to remake itself in the image of the modern world. What followed was a sweeping campaign of assimilation. Ainu were pushed off their lands as settlers from the south poured in by the tens of thousands. The traditional hunting and fishing that were the foundation of Ainu life were restricted and then banned in the places they had always used, cutting a people off from the very basis of their survival. The government established a colonization office and drove organized settlement onto the island, including military farmer colonists, transforming Ezo into a Japanese frontier of farms and towns within a single generation. The Ainu, who held no deeds and no documents for land they had used in common since before memory, were simply written out of the new maps. A law passed in 1899, with the cold honesty of its age, framed them as former primitives to be protected and remade into farmers and subjects. And the deepest cut was aimed at the things that made them a distinct people at all. Children were placed in Japanese language schools where the Ainu language was forbidden. The tattoos that marked Ainu women, the ceremonies, the spiritual practices that had carried their identity for centuries were discouraged and suppressed. Remember that this was a people whose entire history lived in speech, in the spoken epic and the passed-down name. Tell such a people generation after generation not to speak, and you are not merely changing a custom. You are erasing a library that exists only in living memory. It worked, almost completely. By the 1980s, after a century of this pressure, the number of people who still use the Ainu language in daily life had fallen to fewer than 15. A language that had once named every mountain, river, and spirit of the North had been reduced to a handful of voices. This is what lies beneath the beautiful northern landscape of Ghost of Yotei. Not a curse, not a ghost. A near-total erasure, carried out not in one battle, but across 3 centuries, by trade, by betrayal, by law, and by school. And here is the part that should reach forward to you. The Ainu were not lost because they were weak, or because they refused to fight. They fought. Shakushain united a coast, and died for it. They were worn down because the pressure simply never stopped, because each generation met a system built to take a little more, until there was almost nothing left to take. That is how most peoples are lost from history, not in a single famous catastrophe, but in a long, quiet grinding that no one alive ever quite decides to call a tragedy. Think back to that old man and his cup of sake in the autumn of 1669. Shakushain was old enough to remember the North before the chain pulled tight, and he gambled his life on a promise to keep it from closing. The promise was a trap, and when he fell, something larger fell with him. He was among the last of a generation who could still remember the world as it had been, and after him, the forgetting only sped up. So the next time you ride across that northern island in the game, past the perfect cone of Mount Yotei, remember whose world this was. Remember that the land had a name before it was Hokkaido, and a people before it was a setting. Ghost of Yotei lets you become a ghost, haunting your enemies, taking the kind of revenge the dead are never actually granted in life. But the real ghosts of this land were not avengers. They were a people promised peace and handed betrayal, promised protection and handed erasure, who in the end were never able to haunt anyone at all. They are still here though, in the names of the mountains, in a language holding on by a handful of voices, in a history we are only now beginning to listen to. The game lets you haunt that landscape as a ghost. The real ghosts were already there.